you. Thank you, Seema, for joining me today. It's wonderful to discuss the subject of Hindu attitudes towards sex with you, and you know your stuff. You are the expert among the two of us on this, so very privileged to be having this conversation with you today. As you know, I am writing a piece for Beyond the Bindi, and it is titled Hindu Attitudes Towards Sex. It Gets Better Than the Kama Sutra. And we were talking about this just now, but the reason why I'm writing this is not to be provocative for the sake of being provocative. It is to get the community, the Hindu community, to see that this is an area where we could really contribute something, because I look around me, I mean, in this country, there are so many issues to do with sexual health and sexual awareness, or rather the lack of. And if we go back to what, our thought leaders and what our culture actually says, we could come up with a perspective that could help to solve some of those issues. And it might be uncomfortable, but in my opinion, if a conversation is uncomfortable, it's probably worth having. I'd be willing to wager that. So I'm really excited to discuss this with you today and talk a little bit about the Kama Sutra and what it's actually about, not just sex. It's only one chapter out of 7 that's about that. And just the second one. And then talk about how we can, how the Hindu community can play a more active part in tackling issues such as the lack of sexual health and awareness in this country. Yeah.
Thank you, Devika. It's lovely to be talking to you. And yes, at any given point, if we can get this message out further, I'm all for it. So this is great. And I hope that we reach a few more people. And you know how you said that just part 2, section 2 of the Kama Sutra is about sexual pleasure. It's not even about sex, as we know. It's actually just about pleasure. It doesn't at any point. I need to say this every time we mention the word Kama Sutra. We have to put a little qualifying statement. Not a book about sex, not a book about positions. It doesn't even talk about the act of sex. It talks about pleasure, which is hugely different.
It is hugely different. And the act, as it is commonly understood, which just boils down to one thing only, isn't enough to please, is it? So this book said things that now are seen as revolutionary. For instance, we were talking earlier about how in the text, Vatsyayana talks about how the woman, can't, the female kind of experience of pleasure is vastly different to the male experience. So therefore it needs to be treated with care, and to the point where the woman does reach climax first. Absolutely. And saying that now is revolutionary, it's bold.
It is. And also, interestingly, when the Kama Sutra talks about the 64 skills, which again, most people think the 64 skills, the Chauncet Kalas, are all about different sexual things. They're not. They're about understanding botany, what kind of plants grow there and what those plants could be used for. They're about understanding metallurgy. They're about developing a skill in gemology and so on, because it said that it was how diverse a personality you were that made you more attractive. So it wasn't about how much makeup you put on and what kind of clothes you wore. It was the fact that somebody would want to spend time with you. So if you were a really diverse personality, that's what made you really attractive. And interestingly, in today's day and age, when we, like you said, you boil this whole experience of pleasure down to that one act. Here was a time when the Kama Sutra, which again, most people don't know, was dedicated to the goddess Saraswati.
Yes.
Not to Kamdev, to the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning and music, because it said that the culturally diverse man was the most desirable lover of all. And I say man because, again, what most people don't understand is that the Kama Sutra was written for men. Back in 300 something AD when it was written, women were not taught how to read or write. It was written to teach men how to live a good life in the social sector. And section 2, which is about pleasure, was about teaching a man how to be the right kind of lover, how to actually pleasure a woman, because pleasure was the path to heaven, and a woman's pleasure was what the balance of the universe depended on.
Absolutely. And Kama, as we know, which is again not just about sexual desire, it is desire in the broadest possible sense. So it's stimulation of the senses, is one of the four Purushatmas as well, one of the four often translated as objectives of human life, but we know that that's not the best translation. I guess that's a subject for another time. And it is important, it is essential to human life. And it's something that isn't something that you do to have a baby, but you have to do because that's the way you get a baby. And that's the way, you know, it's procreation. You do it because it's a wonderful thing, and it's part of the human life, it's part of the good life. And this is why we see erotic carvings on our mandas, because it is accepted. It's not something that you do and immediately have to atone for, lest you not get into heaven. So it's quite an interesting take on
you know, it's strange you say that,
because it was very different to what I saw when I was growing up, you know, going through the British education system. So my first experience of this was mind-blowing. Yeah.
And it's strange because, like I said, you know, whenever I do a talk, when I was doing my research, you kind of look at the history of the world.
Yeah.
325 AD is when the first ecumenical council of the Catholic Church is set up, and it's set up in Turkey. And it's the first thing they do is start talking about pleasure being the path to hell. And by 342 AD, they have passed their first law banning oral sex, because oral sex is not about having children, it's just about pleasure.
Yeah.
And at almost the exact same time, across the oceans, Vatsyayan is sitting on the river Ganges, and he's writing this book where he's talking about pleasure being the path to heaven, you know. And can you just imagine the dichotomy? I mean, you know, there is this one side of the world saying this is bad, this is the path to hell, and this other lot which is saying this is divine, it's beautiful. And I was just saying to you, you know, I just started learning Sanskrit recently, and Sanskrit is not as simple as translating a word. It's certainly not ancient Sanskrit, which is the literary Sanskrit. Exactly. It's very, very different to the spoken Sanskrit. And we come across this one phrase which comes up in a lot of the ancient Sanskrit plays, which says, and I have to get this right, Sambhog Arth Sharir Pratikram Prasadanam. Yes. And it basically means, pratikram means makeup. So and this is Sharir Prati, so it's about, you know, your adornment of the body. So, which would be the rubbing of the sandal paste and the perfume and the altar under your feet and the jewelry. And it says that when you adorn yourself in preparation for your pleasure, whether that pleasure is for yourself or with a partner, when you adorn yourself in preparation for your pleasure, because pleasure is divine, because it is the path to heaven, your adornment is like the preparation of prasad.
It's beautiful.
How exquisite is that?
It's so beautiful. And it goes.
And yes, pleasure is just so
to be cherished, and pleasure is.
It is absolutely, and pleasure is so diverse. It's not just about that one act. It's like you said earlier. You know, it's about. You know, if we're looking at the goddess Saraswati for inspiration, then it's about reading a good book. It was about understanding how to play. They used to have these festivals where they would play word games. So you would have these word riddles and conundrums, much like the game shows that you have on TV today. They were part of the pleasure. Then theater, you know, that playing games. It's so vast. It's all the things that give you pleasure. One of the most important things in foreplay that a man is supposed to do for a woman, he's supposed to paint a little picture of her. So they always had crayons and paper in there, or not paper, I guess, leaf, some kind of leaf. And yeah, the idea that he would actually draw a picture of her. And I guess it was about communication or just that eye contact. You know, imagine how much one-on-one time you're spending if you're doing that. How exquisite is that?
It's wonderful. I mean, that level of communion is the first word that's coming to my head. I know it's very Christian, but that level of intimacy and closeness that you have with that person, and it's not just about touch, it's about so much else, and communication, non-verbal, is the way it should be. And I mean, obviously it can be thought of like quite, quite obviously when it comes to sexual pleasure, but other types of pleasure, like going to see a play or reading a good book, that is, one-on-one contact with that thing, and it's a very intimate, beautiful interaction you're having there. So why wouldn't you want to cherish that? Why wouldn't you want to revere it? And it's a really wonderful thing. And
what I love about
that it's so much more than just about sexual pleasure.
And what I love about it, so the first section of the Kama Sutra is all about how an urbane man, a man about town, would basically build his house, how he would decorate the house, what he should do, how he should spend the day. He has to talk to his parrots and miners for about an hour. But his bathing routine takes about an hour. So, you have to first be massaged, then you have to be rubbed down with oils, then you would do something else, and then the bathing routine, because it was all part of the understanding the pleasure of everything. Yeah. And somebody in one of their translations, it's a bad translation, but it's good in certain other ways, in the sense that it talks about more than just sex. They remarked that they literally had the ability to turn anything into a form of pleasure. And I think that's what it's about, just about awakening that Shakti inside you, awakening your energies, letting your nerve endings come alive.
And that's the way all pleasure should be, like getting your nerve endings coming alive and getting that real stimulation. It's nothing to be taken lightly. So I've had several conversations with friends about this talk that we're having today and the piece that I'm writing for Beyond the Bindi, and saying it's so much more than what you think is a really interesting kind of topic to start off with. And the WhatsApp chats lately have been very dynamic, let's say. But I think the thing that we need to kind of really get our heads around, and I'm not just saying this as a person who's writing this, but I'm talking about people within the Hindu community and outside of it. And I'll get onto that in a bit more later, like the specific calls to action, I guess, I have both, is that it does literally get better in the Kama Sutra. We've already talked about how, pleasure is a divine act. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad talks about how, the act is divine, where the woman is, like the vagina is like the oven, or something like the oven under the fire, or and that's a really beautiful image, and that kind of goes to show that this is an act to be revered, and that it's not a sin that you have to immediately atone for, which, you spoke about how things were back in, like 320 BC, but now, even now, that attitude is completely revolutionary. And I guess that's why we have things like the sex positivity movement. And we were talking about this earlier, about how it's a very kind of guttural and knee-jerk reaction to very conservative attitudes towards sex. And I do respect a lot of what they do. There are a couple of people, for instance, who are saying some really good things and having very valuable conversations about the welfare of sex workers, about female agency, which again has been watered down in one notable translation of the Kama Sutra, which is something that I'd very much like us to see, like us to kind of reclaim. But what I would really like to see us do, and I'd love to kind of talk about this more with you, Seema, is that I can understand that this is quite an uncomfortable conversation to have, to talk about sex very openly, but it's great that we're doing it. But I would love for it to not be brave or bold, because I remember the last time we spoke, we agreed that we wouldn't be here, none of us would be here if it wasn't for sex, if it wasn't for that act, if it wasn't for pleasure. And why would we then want to kind of like hide it away shamefully?
But I think, Devika, the problem isn't so much about talking about sex, because it's supposed to be something that needs to be done to have children. And so people are aware that it has to be done. It's so long as it's done quietly in a room somewhere, where nobody, it's about, when you talk about pleasure, that's where the big problem comes, because then it becomes uncomfortable for most people. And I find it quite amazing when I do these talks, and I talk about it very widely, I talk about it across the world. It's this, that is the real taboo. Just the idea of pleasure. So long as you have sex, you know, nice clinical, yeah, turn the lights off, you know, you're done in 2 minutes, get pregnant, get on with life, you're fine. It was about pleasure. Pleasure, that's the problem.
Yeah, because it should be pleasurable. You know, sex should be that, and as should many other things in life. It should be respectful, it should be fun, you may even be loving. And that's the thing here. And unfortunately, I think even we as a community have kind of closed ourselves off from having this conversation about, you know, the fact that sex should be pleasurable for, you know, both parties, and it's not just for procreation. When if we were to go back to, you know, what is actually said in the Kama Sutra and in the Upanishads and elsewhere, because it's not just there, it's not just in those two places, then we would see so much about what, you know, Hindu thinking has to say about this. And we would be in a very good place to contribute something very healthy and almost groundbreaking to this conversation, where we have very kind of conservative, very puritanical views towards sex, and the sex positivity movement, which is about, you know, kind of reclaiming your sensuality, and, you know, is often misinterpreted as like anything goes, no boundaries, etc., which it isn't really. It's about kind of autonomy, it's about choice, and the choice to also not engage in sex, because not everybody wants it, and that's completely fine. But by having a very kind of healthy and balanced attitude towards this, where it's just part of human life, it's one of the 4 Purusharthas, so it is part of the good human life, we can have a very healthy and balanced attitude towards sex, where you don't just have a polarized conversation, because that won't do anything to bring people who are kind of teetering on the edge, or who are just unwilling to participate, into the fold and get them to kind of question their attitude towards this subject.
So it's interesting you should say that. You know, there's a term these days that people use a lot, that they are sapiosexual.
Yes.
So where you're only turned on by the intellect, by the, you know, and I was thinking, but this was part of it. You know, whenever I want to have a conversation around it, I always begin with a lot of the other stuff that went into it, because it is so much about the pleasure of the mind. And so many people think that if they're sapiosexual, that they're not normal. A lot of them will write into me and say, unfortunately, I am sapiosexual. I really, that's the only way I feel turned on. And it's not unusual, it's not abnormal. It is the first step. It is the first step for everybody. So it is actually really, really important to understand that that's what gives you pleasure, because it has to start with the mind.
It has to.
It always has to start with the mind.
You need to have an engaging conversation with someone. And, you know, I've had an interesting time, you know, kind of lockdown online dating, you know, with things like Bumble and Hinge. And I see quite a few men saying that they're sapiosexual. And I'm thinking, isn't that the bare minimum? And there's this, you know, you're seeing the like, oh, unfortunately, I'm a sapiosexual. I'm seeing another side to it, where they are very snobbish about it. And it's almost like, you know, I'm better than you because I expect this. And
because I actually can do it.
Neither are healthy. It is literally, as you say, the first step, because, you know, if you're kind of doing a certain thing before the other, then is that really the right way? You know, is it gonna
it's just,
is it gonna
the thing is also, I think what I feel, so we come from a culture where literally the idea of karma or love has been broken down to every teensy little aspect of it, because everything is an aspect of love. You know, when we study tantra, we're told that there are no opposites, everything is part of the same circle. So you know, whether you're thinking about it from this point of view or from here, it's not black and white, or yes and no, or good or bad. It's the same thing. And the shift from one point of view to the next is so minuscule that you don't even realize when you get to the other side. So it's all part of the same thinking cycle. And I was just saying, you know, recently to somebody that, for instance, when we talk about hate now in the English language, or in the languages that we use today, it's separate to love. There's love, there's hate. But in ancient India, it was a part of love. So it was somebody that you might have loved at one point, and now you feel the other way about them. And it could be that you might go back to loving them, because the mind is very, very fickle. There is nothing stable about the mind. The mind changes all the time. And so, we have literally, and when we break down, for instance, the ragas, the music that is written, and you depict a woman in love, it's not straightforward like the Hallmark cards which say, I am a woman in love, or I love you. So you have, in some cases, the woman who is pining for the man that she loves. In another one, I like this one. The man, she's with the man that she loves, but he's been there for far too long, and now she's fed up. She needs a bit of time away from him. So she's the fed up woman.
Yeah.
And then there's the other one who is like, okay, I normally love when you do this, but today I'm really getting annoyed with you. So can you change the way that you are today? Because I am in a different mood. And so, you know what I mean? Like, love comes in so many different forms. And your pleasure depends very much upon how you're feeling that day. So first of all, I'd like everybody to sort of stop thinking of pleasure as the act of sex and thinking of it as so many other things. Think of all the things that make you happy. Think of wearing perfume. Wearing perfume, according to the Kama Sutra, was a real art. Every part of the body had to be fragranced with a different perfume, because each part of the body reacts differently to a different fragrance. And so you perfumed yourself, and just that whole act of perfuming yourself. So both men and women would do it, but that whole act of perfuming yourself was pleasurable, or somebody perfuming you. And the fact that at the end of it, you became like a banquet of textures and smells. So, somebody would literally travel down your body with different fragrances. I just think that's amazing. Or the fact that they believe, again, in the Kama Sutra, there's a chapter on how, as the moon moves in its phases, your erogenous zones move around your body. Now, we know that the moon impacts your moods, it impacts your thinking. And these are also your Shakti points. So as the moon moves, your Shakti points move around your body, your erogenous zones move around the body. And so every day you feel differently. And so one day, on the night of the full moon, generally, they say that all your pleasure is concentrated here. On the next day, it's the eyes, then it's the cheeks, and so on. There is so much more to pleasure than we think. And you were saying to me earlier about the Kama Sutra being mistranslated and so on. The problem is, it's not that it's mistranslated linguistically. So there are people who understand Sanskrit and English equally well, so they were translated. The problem is, it's a treatise, much like the Arthashastra, much like the you were mentioning the Brihadaranya Upanishad. There are so many treaties. We know that a treatise is written in metaphor and in very complex grammar. So you cannot just translate sort of linguistically from one language to another. You have to understand what those metaphors meant. And that is where we've actually lost out on the Kama Sutra, because we don't have enough scholars who understand what those metaphors mean. I spent 10 years trying to study this, 10 years, 11 years, I think it is now, of just trying to understand the metaphors. And, it's so, okay, let me give you a little example. When you got ready, your Sola Shringar, so the idea of intimacy was a thing of beauty. It's not about wash your makeup off, get into your old nightie, switch the lights off, and then you have sex. No. So it's about, it was special. It was divine. So you got dressed for it. And your 16 ornaments, your 16, your Sola Shringar. The last thing that you do is you place a little lotus bud behind your ear. And the reason for this is that according to the ancient rules, when the sun came up, you had to stop making love. Basically, you woke up, you didn't do anything else, you prayed to the sun god, and then you got on with your day. So if you were indoors and the curtains were shut, you didn't know that the sun had come up, the lotus blossoms as soon as the sun comes up. So this would blossom. So it is almost like an alarm clock behind your ear. And in our ancient paintings and literature, you have the woman hiding it because she doesn't want to leave the arms of her lover. And so you have music for that. So you have the Rag Bhairav. The Rag Bhairav is a very stern rag to which you wake up. Then you have the Rag Bhatyar. Bhatyar is the one that allows you 15 minutes. So basically you can say, okay, should I wake up or can I just sort of sleep for another 10, 15 minutes? So it's the Rag Bhatyar, which this woman has noticed that the lotus is blossoming. She's going to have to get up soon, but she's taking a few extra minutes to go back into her lover's arms to enjoy those last few minutes. And that is the Rag Bhatyar. So if you played the Rag Bhatyar, you knew exactly what was happening. You didn't have to get graphic and say what was happening.
You just knew.
You just knew.
Yeah.
And so, you know what I mean? Like, I'm talking about in literature, you know, because like you said, the Kama Sutra and the Brihadaranyaka is not the only place where all this is mentioned. The Kama Sutra inspired 2000 years of Prakrit literature. And it's all, they're all epic romances. Kalidas, Bhoj, everybody all wrote on this subject. Our fiction is based on this. So the idea is that pleasure is so exquisitely beautiful, but because it's beautiful, it has to be treated like an art form. It's not coarse. It's not about like, bang, bam, thank you, ma'am. You know, there is much more to it. And I love the idea that, you know, the Kama Sutra talks about all this. Unfortunately, when people say to me, what's a good translation to read? I can never quite answer it because how do you, I mean, none of them have translated the metaphors. So how do I say to somebody, okay, well, you go here and this is where you'll get the information.
Yeah, because it's not that clear cut, is it, as we talked about? And it's a myriad of things that, you know, need to be considered when you're dealing with a subject like this, for sure. But I talked earlier about how I see that there's a real opportunity for us to, you know, deal with the lack of sexual awareness and the lack of sexual health in this country. And I remember kind of saying to you earlier that every 4 minutes a young person in this country is diagnosed with an STI, which is terrifying considering the potential long-term impact on one's health, on their fertility, etc. It can really, you know, the impact here is potentially huge and lifelong. And I think there are reports also of some women having to wait 2 weeks or longer for a contraceptive appointment. And goodness knows how that's been impacted by COVID as well. And I do know that in the wake of COVID, I think about 50 local authorities have been closing their sexual health clinics permanently because of the lack of resource and funding. Because everything quite naturally has gone to the priority of saving lives in the COVID pandemic. But I do worry that there are going to be, you know, other kind of sexual health impacts. We're talking about the mental health crisis, but I would like for there to be more attention paid to the sexual health of young people in this country and older people, because, you know, we're not talking about it properly. We're not really sure what like healthy, safe sex is, really. And I think us, with our very balanced view towards the act as being part of a good human life, as is all forms of pleasure, is something really revolutionary that we could offer here. And I know I said at the beginning that I'm not doing this to be provocative for the sake of it. I do really see that there is an opportunity here for us. And I know, Seema, like, I know we've talked about this before, but there's, in my mind, there's a very typical, in my experience, there's a very typical way these kind of conversations happen. So we talk about a problem in society, and in this case, we're talking about sexual health, sexual awareness, or a healthy attitude towards sex. And you know, there'll be people who say, oh, but, you know, we're pretty liberal and forward thinking about this, and any kind of issues that we're seeing, that's down to like colonialism or colonial conditioning, and, you know, down to Christianity and empire. But the problem's still happening, and what are we contributing to make it better? The onus really is on us, only on us, to do that for ourselves and to do that for the broader conversation. So what's stopping us? And given that, you know, I recited these stats earlier, and I know, Seema, you and I were talking earlier about how Plan UK, they launched a campaign a couple of years ago, And as part of that, they found that almost 70% of women and girls, so from 14 to 21, had faced sexual harassment in the public place in this country. That's crazy. I think I must have been about 13, 14 the first time I faced it. And, still do, at 31 years old. So this is a real, it's not okay. And the fact that this happens to all of us is a problem that needs to be tackled. And by us kind of saying sex is part of life, it's nothing to be feared, it's not a sin that we need to atone for, that you kind of do hushed in the corner, you do it in your nightie and you turn off the lights. It's actually a very divine act to be revered between two people. Then we're bringing something new to the conversation that isn't sex as a sin and we have no boundaries, this is the sexual revolution, that
actually just to go back to
and bring more people on side, because I do worry that the sex positivity movement, as much as I do respect a lot of what the people within it are saying, are already just speaking to the converted rather than speaking to the people who are on the fringes, and they're the ones that need to criticize their own thinking.
So, going back to your point on sexual harassment, we have discovered, as you know, I run a podcast on YouTube with Anvita, who's a psychosexual therapist. And we have discovered that the more taboo you make the subject, the worse the problem of sexual harassment becomes, because this means that girls cannot come and tell their parents about it. They cannot be open about it and sort of blame the perpetrator publicly, or not blame, but shame the perpetrator publicly, because it's always about, you must have done something to encourage it, or don't talk about it. Yeah. And so I just think that we're actually not doing ourselves and our kids any favors by making it taboo. I also understand that it's very difficult to kind of go from here to here in one fell swoop. You can't. And we have to take a leaf out of the Kama Sutra's teachings, because again, as we were discussing, the Kama Sutra is written for men. It's not all about sex. It's only section 2 that deals with it. And that's the only place where they talk about equality for women in the area of pleasure. Because as we know from the corporate sector, when you want to create change, you have to do it incrementally, a teensy bit at a time, and you have to make it aspirational. So if you kind of go saying, sex is taboo, no, it's absolutely fine, nobody is going to kind of go with that. So you have to change it just a little bit at a time. So even if we were to say that, all right, let's just talk about pleasure, let's talk about the less intimidating parts of pleasure, talk about the perfuming, talk about the different pieces of jewelry that give you pleasure, talk about all the 64 skills, talk about dance, talk about music, talk about all the other things that give you an immense amount of pleasure.
And then that's a way of kind of easing people in, because polarized conversations don't result in anything that's sustainable. And this is currently what we're seeing, isn't it? And you're absolutely right that if we do take a leaf from the Kama Sutra, especially section 2, in the way that we'd like to kind of see, that is the chapter that has does talk about female agency and equality among sexes, which I know Bert and Argonaut did completely ignored in their translation, which has been vastly criticized, and I'm all for that. We can hope to kind of come up with a sustainable solution to this, because there's a lot of problems that need fixing, and so why wouldn't we want to contribute something to it and actually kind of show that we are as liberal as we say we are? And like I said, the onus is only on us to do that.